Hi everyone, just letting everybody in. Put your cameras on. It's always good to see smiling faces.
Hi Leah. Sister from another mister, how are you? We're just muting everybody.
I'm very well. How are you all?
That was it just came up. Good, thank you.
It's all right. For quite a few people jumping on.
It's excellent.
Excelente. Well, welcome everyone. This is our special edition, Lunch and Learn. It's an economic update, and we've seen and heard lots of things, but today will be an up-to-date economic update from our gold partners, the NAB. And we do have Arania, who's in the room today, waving. I'm sure most of you have seen her. She's been in franchising space for many, many years and knows probably a lot of you on the call today. If you don't know her, always reach out. Good news is there is a special pack that will be sent to you on everything that Taylor is going to talk about today when I send you the recording. So good news. If you have anything to ask, a question, we'll be doing that at the end, last 15 minutes. But if it's pertinent to what Taylor's saying and, you know, you really feel that you want the answer, please type it in the chat and then Lisa can read that out for you all. But from me, Lisa Baxter and Georgia, who's online, let's get on to it. So today we've got Taylor Nugent. He's the senior economist at the NAB, and he's going to be giving us, like as I said, an economic update. His focus is on the outlook for houses, businesses and interest rates. Need we say any more? But I will hand it all over onto him, and let's have a really good next half an hour.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. It's thanks for having me along. Certainly an interesting time at the moment. There are no shortage of things to discuss. We obviously have the RBA tightening policy again. They've increased interest rates 3 times so far this year. We've got the budget that just came out a couple of weeks ago. It feels like a long time ago now.
Oh, economic update. Maybe Taylor from...
Someone needs to mute their phone.
That's right. We'll charge on. And we've also obviously got, the global backdrop is far from benign. There's a lot of uncertainty out there, and that situation in the Middle East is creating new challenges for businesses and households in the form of cost pressure. So I'll try and break that down and give our best guess, get the crystal ball out and try and describe how we think things are likely to evolve. But very much given how much uncertainty there is in the backdrop, very much thinking about this in terms of what are the risks out there, how could things evolve, what should we be thinking about, rather than something that says that, we can predict the future and this is exactly what's going to happen. So in saying that, why don't I start off with a little bit of a quick high-level comment on the federal budget and how we're kind of mapping that onto the outlook. Overall, there were certainly some changes in this budget on the tax reform side, but on budget night there wasn't much additional surprise, I guess. There's really 2 ways that we look at the budget. We're not accountants, we're not tax advisors, so we're not really in the weeds of the tax detail, but we look at it from the perspective of how much demand is the federal government policy setting adding into the economy this year versus last year. Is there a fiscal impulse that is stimulatory or contractionary, and how does that interact with what the RBA is trying to do? And then secondly, what do those kind of longer term reforms mean for kind of the fiscal settings going forward? So on the former, is this budget stimulatory or is it weighing down on demand and slowing things down? Essentially neither. It's broadly neutral. It's not really moving the dial in either direction in terms of speeding up or slowing down the economy and helping or making life more difficult for the RBA as they try and get on top of the inflation challenges that we have. When we think about what's driving that, we did get a small downward revision to deficit forecasts, but in the near term, the structural deficit next year is likely to be similar size to this year. More interesting than those sorts of that sort of detail is we did get a shift on tax settings, which I'll come to in a second. Just unpacking that broader comment a little bit more, if we look at the what's called the underlying cash balance, so effectively how much more is the government spending than they're raising in revenue each financial year, we can see that it is projected to be a little bit smaller than it was at the MyEPO half-year budget update. But really, what's driving that is not policy decisions; it's what are called parameter variations. So that's effectively saying that the earlier forecasts were wrong, and they were wrong in a way that means spending was a bit lower and revenue was a bit higher than what they'd earlier expected. So that's been supportive. When we look at net policy decisions, those over the next couple of years are actually adding a little bit to the budget deficit. But when we look at kind of where spending is, net spending is next year compared to this financial year, it's really not moving the dial in terms of the economic cycle. When we look further out on this chart, you can see that red bar, the contribution of policy decisions, is pretty supportive way out towards 2030. And really what that's showing is that some of those savings measures that were in the budget, particularly the effort to rein in cost growth in the NDIS, that is something that is supportive, and that's what's driving that improvement in the budget deficits further out in the forecast horizon. So the important point there is that for this outlook to be realised, there needs to be followed through on some of those savings measures, and a lot of those savings measures have also seen already announced policy decisions in other areas that spend some of those measures as well. So this outlook certainly is relying on some of these savings expectations that are being built in, being borne out over time. If we think about this from kind of a long-term, fiscal sustainability perspective, there's pressures on government budgets globally, not just in Australia. We have aging of populations, which is increasing demands for aged care and healthcare spending. And we also just have this environment in which, there is growing demand for the care economy more broadly. That is spending that tends to be funded by government, and so that is increasing spending demands on government as well. In the background, we also have this environment that Australia has not been immune to, where debt levels kind of move higher in a crisis, and then they don't really come back down once we kind of move past that crisis. And so we do get this kind of step effect where kind of debt moves higher, doesn't really repair, moves higher again in the next crisis. And what we're seeing at the moment is there's not a huge amount of downward pressure on those government debt levels. The context here, though, is that Australia compares very, very favourably when you look across countries. Australia has a lot more fiscal headroom than almost any other advanced economy that you would compare us to. And so that's not, to say that these pressures aren't real, but they're certainly not as pressing as they are, certainly as we're seeing in the UK at the moment with the extent of the discussion around fiscal sustainability there. So when we think about that, fiscal sustainability question, these pressures on government finances, the spending demands on governments over time, one thing that's obviously relevant in that is, okay, well, where is the money coming from? And that comes back to the tax mix. And we did get a fair bit of movement on that front in this budget, certainly by the standards of recent history. And so I think, one overall positive thing to come out of this is that we saw this in the opposition's budget reply speech as well, is that the margins of discussion are, some more meaningful reform. There's kind of much more of a robust debate about appropriate tax settings and the appropriate tax mix now than there has been for a while, where the kind of margins of adjustment were reasonably small. The context for these reforms are, most reviews into the tax mix in Australia finds that there's an over-reliance on labour income tax and an under-reliance on what are called indirect taxes, so effectively the GST. What we didn't see this time was any effort to pull that GST lever and increase revenues that way and take that pressure off income taxation. But what we did see was a movement towards a focus on the capital income side and the capital gains side. The thing with these reforms is kind of the revenue flow through from this takes time to flow through. They're kind of largely grandfathered. There's no massive revenue increases in the short term. But what we can see with the earned income tax offset, and that the Treasurer has kind of repeated this more recently as well, is that the infrastructure is there to reduce that pressure on income taxes over time as that flows through. And so there is a movement here towards a bit of a mix shift over time, taking that pressure away from bracket creep and ever increasing income tax take on the labour income side towards a bit more of a broader base there. The other point of the reforms and the way it's being messaged is around trying to kind of shift the incentives around housing investment. And certainly the changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax, they do shift those incentives away at the margin from those high debt, low yielding strategies in investment property. And we think that, you know, the directional impact of this is pretty clear, but we don't want to overstate how much of an impact it will have. It's not going to, you know, completely fix the structural housing undersupply overnight. But what it will do is we think directionally this is negative for house prices. We think it will be an effect in, you know, in the single digits, probably the small single digits, but, you know, there are some confidence channels that could change things a little bit there and add a bit of uncertainty. And we also expect it will mean a little bit of a shift away from investor purchases towards first home buyer purchases at the margin as well. Again, only at the margin, but there certainly is a bit of a shift in incentives that's on the back of this policy. And so, you know, that's a bit of a summary of how we're thinking about the budget. What's missing is those kind of broader reform pieces, meaningful changes that could drive some productivity growth. But there are some limited efforts in that regard in terms of regulatory simplicity. We'll see what the follow through is there. There's an enabling package of spending to unlock housing supply and help on that front. But yeah, in general, we do see these as, you know, not meaning there's going to be a meaningful shift in the short term in those housing dynamics. But yeah, small negative for house price growth in the short term. That budget is coming in against a cyclical backdrop in which we've already had a very meaningful interest rates repricing over the last year or so, and we'd already seen a meaningful slowing in momentum in house price growth from, you know, to be fair, the exceptional pace that we'd seen over the past couple of years. So I think it's worth just kind of stepping back and thinking through what drove that U-turn. It was a very fast U-turn by central bank standards, especially the RBA. They like to be kind of slow moving and gradual. And we saw them cutting in August. Market pricing and their own guidance was for another couple of cuts. And what we got instead was a hike in February and two more since then. So what drove that? There's two parts to this. One is the approach that the RBA has taken this cycle and continues to take, and that is to put a lot of weight on the full employment side of their mandate and be quite patient on inflation pressure. So effectively, they've tolerated higher inflation for longer than some other central banks have been comfortable doing. And they've done that in order to minimize any cycle in the economy and the labor market and not open up any unnecessary spare capacity or weakness in the economy that isn't kind of absolutely necessary on the inflation objective. The benefit of that is that the labor market has remained healthy for longer, but the cost of that is that they just didn't have any buffer if things didn't turn out exactly as they expected. And as we moved through last year, there were a few things that came in all in the same direction that just said policy is probably in the wrong place and needs to be recalibrated. So what were those things? One of them is that growth picked up a bit stronger than was expected. Again, that's kind of good news. It was led by the private sector, it was led by investment, it was led by discretionary consumption, but it just didn't have space to grow into. And we hit capacity constraints and saw a rebuilding of inflationary pressure a bit sooner than expected as well. It's also the case that broader financial conditions weren't quite as restrictive as they had expected. And so, you know, one piece of evidence for that was the strength of housing lending growth through 2025 just wasn't consistent with their assessment that they still had their foot a little bit on the brake. Another one that's pretty important is that the global backdrop through much of last year was expected to be at least a modest headwind. It was more, how much of a headwind is it going to be? And in the end, it was not really a factor in the domestic cycle. You know, we saw some of a hit from the disruptions to trade that we saw from tariffs coming out of the US, but we had this offset from AI investment. We had an offset from a bit more fiscal spending and defense spending in Europe. And in the end, it just wasn't really a big factor in that domestic cycle. So that got us from cuts in August to a hike in February. And then since then, we're layering on a negative supply shock in terms of these disruptions that are occurring in the Middle East at the moment that have made things trickier again for the RBA and for central banks everywhere, to be fair. But the RBA starting point was a bit different. And so when we think about, the RBA having tightened 3 times this year, the RBNZ over in New Zealand met earlier today. They didn't increase interest rates, but they're getting close. It looks like they will reasonably shortly. The reason why the RBA has already moved and they haven't is that starting point was a little bit different facing into this shock. So how should we think about this shock and how it flows through the economy? One easy place to start is if we think about this as an energy shock, well, who is a net energy importer and who is a net energy exporter? And from that perspective, Australia is comparatively well placed. We do export more energy commodities than we import. That's certainly been helpful from the currency's perspective. The Australian dollar has seen some support as a result of what we have on the export side. But it's important to recognise here that that's not a get out of jail free card. And we're seeing it flow through from a cost perspective on the import side. Because when we look at exports, it's LNG and it's coal. There's been a price response there, especially in LNG, less so in coal. But it's much more obvious on the import side, where we're importing refined oil products from the Asia Pacific. And the where that shows up in the economy is much broader as well. It shows up in households, at the petrol pump, and it shows up for businesses through logistics, through exposure to petrochemical supply chains. It shows up in a breadth of price increases that the businesses face. So how does Australia fit into this? There's obviously very material risks here. We don't know how things are going to resolve. Certainly there's been some positive signals over the past few days that maybe the US and Iran are moving towards some kind of interim deal. It feels like we've been here before, so it's hard to be confident that that's going to show fruit quickly. But in terms of how we're thinking about these disruptions, it's the normal state of affairs is that you have some large deficit regions in the world in terms of oil. They're in Europe, they're in the Asia Pacific, and you have one very large surplus region, which is the Middle East. And what I'm showing on the right-hand chart there, I've got oil exporting regions on the left and oil importing regions on the right. And you can see the Asia Pacific in purple and the Middle East in red. And it's overstating things a bit, but not too much, to say that kind of Middle Eastern surplus flows to our region. And so it is the case that while the Middle East is a long way away geographically, this is more of an Asia Pacific centric shock than it might look on face value. So how is it flowing through? Certainly it is the case that the impacts of the physical supply disruption aren't being felt particularly acutely at the moment. So we saw a real spike higher in prices through March. They've come back down quite noticeably for those refined products in the region as they kind of scramble for immediate supply has eased. But it's important to recognise that part of the reason why we're not feeling this disruption so acutely at the moment is because there's a lot of levers that are being pulled to absorb that impact. If we think about global oil supply and demand, it's about 100 million barrels per day. About 10% of that is offline because of the disruptions in the Middle East. About 5 million barrels is in demand destruction. The global economy is using less oil in response to these higher prices. But the rest of that gap, which is a big gap, is being covered by effectively inventory drawdown. That's something that can bridge a short-term disruption, but it's not something that can last forever. So it is the case that kind of the longer this drags on, it could very much get worse in terms of the price impact before it gets better. On the other hand, if we do see a resolution in the short term, it's also not the case that these pressures are just going to disappear overnight. It's going to take time to normalise, and so we do think that a material shock has already been felt. And here in Australia, that's relevant because we are quite reliant on refined oil products, quite car-centric, and in terms of diesel usage in particular, there's a heavy reliance on road transport over large distances, which makes diesel especially relevant as a cost pressure here in Australia. So the question now is kind of, okay, well, with those pressures that are there, how are they echoing through the economy and what's that doing to the outlook? So again, kind of the starting point facing into this was growth that picked up through 2025, led by private investment, led by discretionary consumption, but that was unsustainable. The supply side is unhelpful at the moment. It's not the benign post-GFC period where we're just trying to create demand. We need to manage it within what the supply side of the economy can sustain. And that was a bit too strong what we saw over 2025, and that was evident in those inflation pressures that we were seeing. So we were already expecting growth to slow. That was already driving that recalibration that we saw from the RBA to help support that outcome. And now we're overlaying a shock that adds to price pressures, but also slows growth. And so we can see that in our business survey over the past couple of months. Businesses are saying that confidence has fallen back very sharply. But we're also seeing into business conditions. So it's not just how businesses are feeling about the outlook, where incredible uncertainty is weighing, but it's also what they're seeing in terms of conditions today. And we're seeing a kind of improvement that we saw in business conditions through 2025 largely unwind. But perhaps kind of more startling in the survey is just the extent of cost pressures that are showing up. So it's showing up in purchase costs, most obviously, but it's also flowing through into output prices. And so I think that just, essentially what we're looking at in the outlook is those themes that were there in, say, 2023 of cost pressures that were still elevated, a demand environment that wasn't as supportive, and that was showing up in margin pressures. Some of it was flowing through into end prices, but you couldn't pass all of it downstream. Unfortunately, we think that some of those themes are likely to be re-emerging and be a feature of the next year or two. We're not expecting them to be quite as material as what we saw during that previous period, but we certainly think there could be some echoes of that kind of experience as those cost pressures reaccelerate and the demand side is less conducive to passing those on to the end consumer. A question then that we're watching for is, well, how is this flowing through? Where are these cost pressures that are quite evident? Where are they ending up? Are they getting absorbed into margins or are they flowing through into end prices? We got the April inflation data earlier today, and it didn't show a huge amount of breadth in terms of price increases already. It could be it's just a bit early. It takes time for these things to flow through, and certainly we expect this to be evident through kind of the May and June data and even into the second half of this year. But certainly through kind of grocery prices, they were a bit softer than expected, and nothing there to really suggest that there is kind of rapid pass-through of these higher transport costs flowing through already. But we do think that the inflation outlook is getting worse before it gets better, and that is something that we think is going to be weighing on household spending as well, as some of those real income pressures re-emerge, and we see discretionary consumption being a bit of a driver in terms of that response. Again, it's important not to be too negative here. The starting point was reasonably strong. Household incomes were growing again, real incomes were growing again, and households had, as real incomes improved, as inflation had cooled, as real wages were growing, they had not only increased their spending, restored their kind of comeback to discretionary spending growth, they'd also repaired their normal savings behavior as well. So households weren't saving much when real incomes were really under pressure, but they were saving a bit more than they were out of their income in 2019, just before they're facing into this shock. So households are in a pretty good starting point, but we certainly think that this will flow through into a bit of a slowing. We're watching our internal data quite closely as well to try and get a sense of how much and how quickly these dynamics are flowing through. And so far, you'd have to say it's a story of resilience. There certainly was some clear underperformance in a lot of discretionary categories through March, but it certainly wasn't a collapse. And we've even seen some signs of a little bit of stabilization through April. That's not completely broad-based. Certainly travel spending is one area that does look a little bit softer than some other discretionary categories. But really through a lot of discretionary services and discretionary goods categories, there's nothing here to suggest that households have really, fallen off a cliff in terms of their spending behavior so far. But we do think that it's a theme of a little bit of a slowing in growth. Nothing approximating recessionary conditions though, unless we get, something, a re-flare up in tensions, volatility in financial markets that sees those kind of confidence channels really start to dominate. That's not what we're kind of seeing at the moment. Thinking through that kind of consumer story as well, if we look back over the past few years, there's that aggregate story where you saw real incomes falling, you saw that flow through in a pullback in discretionary consumption, but not a huge amount of kind of financial stress, I should add. It wasn't necessarily the case that households were struggling to meet their essential expenses. They were able to use that discretionary spending as the margin of adjustment, but there was a bit of variation across age groups in particular, but also across regions. So across regions, those smaller states, Western Australia, Queensland, South Australia, they've been outperforming through the pandemic. They've continued to outperform, and so there is some tailwinds for growth there that have continued to be a support. Population dynamics being a key one, where certainly both growing faster than they were prior to the pandemic and also bigger than they were prior to the pandemic because of that shift in where people live during the initial COVID impacts. But the other thing that I think is interesting to call out in terms of where this has been felt by demographics is through that adjustment that we saw post-pandemic in spending, it was younger households that drove the slowdown in spending. Older households, less exposed to higher interest rates through mortgages, less exposed to the rental market, have higher savings buffers. We didn't see as much of an adjustment flow through in spending there, where those demographics that led the response were those that were exposed to rapid rents increases, a little bit more exposed to kind of via large mortgages, to the interest rate cycle, and also just fewer buffers to smooth through this kind of shock. That's where the cycle in spending has been most obvious. Encouragingly, it's not a story like we often hear about in the US of this K-shaped economy, where it's the high income, high wealth demographics that are driving all the spending and there's a soft underbelly. Because as things were improving through late 24 and through 2025, those groups that were underperforming drove the reacceleration as well. So there was a little bit of catch up in terms of growth there. Looking forward, it's fair to say that some of those themes might re-emerge in terms of where this modest slowdown in consumption growth that we're anticipating is likely to flow through. But I would say that a key part of what drove this difference by age was that exposure to the rental markets and the rent cycle. And we don't expect that to be as much of a story in terms of those income pressures this time around, I guess you could say. So just moving on from that story, if you're thinking about this from a central banker's perspective, they don't like a negative supply shock. It has competing pressure on both sides of their mandate. It's likely to be a weakening labour demand and could see some easing in the labour market, but it's creating inflation pressure. The way that they balance these is to be focused on whether they think inflation will stay high. They can't do anything to offset near-term inflation pressure, but they can lean against the risk that becomes more persistent. You see it in second-round effects. It flows through into broader costs through the economy. Households are able to kind of bid up their wages growth, protect themselves from that real income shock, keep spending. Or if those sorts of dynamics emerge, then that's something that keeps inflation elevated next year and into 2028. That's what the RBA is most worried about. And importantly, those worries will fade if we see easing in the labour market. And so that's where they're kind of balancing, they're watching for how much of a hit to activity, to labour demand, to the labour market are we seeing, because that will change things around how we're thinking about the risks of how high inflation is going to stay. So when we think about the labour market, the unemployment rate, it did tick higher in April. We saw that in data last week. There's a couple of reasons we're a little bit skeptical that suggests the labour market's easing rapidly and quickly. One of the reasons for that is that the timing of Easter always adds a bit of volatility in April. Another one is that when you look at the data closely, what we saw was a fallback in hiring, but we saw an increase in hours worked and not necessarily an increase in layoffs. So you take all of those facts together, and one explanation for this could be, we don't have enough to answer this conclusively. We'll be watching the data as it comes in, but it could be during the peak of that uncertainty, businesses just hit pause. They deferred any long-term hiring decisions. They wanted to wait things out, but in the meantime, they use existing staff a bit more intensively. And so that could mean that we get, it's not necessarily a signal of kind of, a big hit to labour demand, and certainly other indicators, including job ads, similar to what I've been talking through on consumption, slowing, moving in that direction, but not quickly and not with the same kind of urgency as that data says at face value. So that's something that makes us think that the RBA won't be spooked just yet by the labour market data, but they'll be looking at it pretty closely. Certainly, if the unemployment rate keeps moving higher from here, that's something that's going to mean those concerns about persistent inflation fade pretty quickly, and it probably means that we're likely to be looking to the other side of the tightening cycle, and we could start thinking about cuts. But if the labour market stays somewhat resilient in the short term, then those dynamics continue to be a bit more balanced. On the labour market, another interesting dynamic that I think is worth calling out, again, both regionally and compositionally within the labour market, is the smaller states, Queensland, WA, South Australia, unemployment rates remain much lower than they were prior to the pandemic, and they haven't shown as obvious a cooling as what we've seen in Melbourne in particular, but also in Sydney. And so labour market conditions are noticeably tighter than pre-pandemic in those smaller states. The other thing that's relevant is when you look by occupation, it's a story where if people who are unemployed, if they were previously employed in a white-collar job, managerial and professional roles, unemployment is a little bit more common than it was prior to the pandemic. In contrast, if you're in a blue-collar role, technicians, machinery operators, tradespeople, labourers, these sorts of occupations, unemployment is still much, much less common and hasn't risen much over the past couple of years. And so there is this shift in relative scarcity where those labour constraints seem to be binding more tightly in areas like construction or areas that are trying to compete for work among blue-collar workers, whereas there's a bit more rebalancing in white-collar workers. When we look forward, those kind of aggregate labour market stories that we're thinking about will probably see a little bit of cooling. The unemployment rate will probably move higher, something closer to 4.75% next year. That these kind of relativities in terms of where the labour market is relatively tight or relatively less tight, we can't see anything that's really going to change those dynamics quickly either. And so even when you kind of layer AI risk, for instance, on top of this, we don't think that's going to flow through quickly. But certainly at the margin, it probably says that, that relative, that demand for white collar employment might not, reaccelerate as fast, and we could see the labour market remaining a bit tighter in blue collar work. So just before I conclude and open it up for any questions, just a quick comment on, the RBA in context. So they've hiked 3 times this year. What I would say is we were getting at least 2, maybe 3 of those anyway, that the domestic conditions already needed the RBA to recalibrate. And when you look at this chart with the RBA compared to a number of other central banks, the key thing for me is, again, that kind of the different approach that the RBA took. The RBA has policy back as high or as tight as it was at the peak of the previous tightening cycle. But again, the peak of the previous tightening cycle wasn't that tight compared to what other central banks did. And so that kind of cumulative restriction that they've been putting into the system hasn't been as large. That's why we were always only getting a shallower cutting cycle, but it's also one of the reasons why they've had to turn around so quickly. When we look forward, our expectation is that the RBA probably hasn't done enough here to be comfortable that they've balanced the risks sufficiently in terms of inflation risks on the one hand versus those downside risks to growth in the labour market on the other. So our base case is that they'll tighten policy once more in August, but we would need to see the data come in a way that continues to show resilience in spending, shows a little bit more stabilisation coming through in the labour market in the next couple of months, and those cost pressures that are evident in the survey showing up in the inflation data. That's something that if that comes through as we expect, then the RBA will get another increase in August. When we think about the risks around that, if we're wrong, if there's a bit more softness, then maybe there's nothing to really push the RBA to deliver that extra increase. What I would say further out is, I shouldn't completely ignore the other scenario there, of course. It is possible that some of this uncertainty resolves. We get some good news out of the Middle East in the near term. Fuel prices, those cost pressures, they're not extreme, but they are material, and they're not in a world in which they're not that extreme. Then they're not seeing as much of that demand destruction, and you're just kind of bubbling along with this extra cost pressure in the system and demand that's okay if unexceptional, and we just get stubborn inflation. That's a world in which the RBA might have to do even more. But yeah, at the moment, we're thinking about this in terms of, we think the RBA is probably going to get another one in. But the broader point is that the RBA needed to get policy back to a level that was weighing down on the economy, that was slowing things to get on top of inflation. They've got that there now. Policy is restrictive. It's more a question of, is it restrictive enough? Should they tighten a little more? But what it means is, unless we get kind of repeated shocks or some other surprise comes through, you fast forward to next year, we think we should be looking at, well, what does the cutting cycle look like? Because policy, we don't think it stays in the mid-4s long term. We think it does fall back, not to pre-pandemic levels, to be clear. Our kind of longer term anchor is somewhere in the mid-3s is where policy rates should belong in normal circumstances. And so we should start looking towards, well, what does a cutting cycle look like if things play out as we expect? It's a challenging 12 to 18 months. These cost pressures are real. It's a more challenging demand environment, but then they start to fade into the rearview mirror, and the RBA is left with inflation that's increasingly in the rearview mirror, a labour market that's no longer tight, no longer concerned for inflation, and they can take their foot back off the brake. So that's how we're thinking about the path forward from here. And certainly from that perspective, if we think about 3-year yields, for instance, at around 4.5%, there is still a bit of two-sided risk around that. Certainly could move higher if we get a bit of resilience in the data like we expect. The RBA delivers an increase in August. But it's also the case that the further out you look, the more financial markets are pricing policy rates staying reasonably elevated in the floors. So it certainly could be the case that as we roll through, as the data comes in, as the kind of a bit more shape comes into that outlook for central banks, that these longer term yields fall back a little bit as well. So with that, I'm conscious of time. I promised you 15 minutes for questions. I've given you 10, so I apologize for that, but very interested if there are any questions on the call.
Excellent. Feel free to just take yourself off mute, ask the question, or if you want to type something. I think there was a question, but not
around
trusts. It was around trusts.
Trusts and tax.
Yeah.
I should caveat this with kind of our team, our focus is kind of it's the economic backdrop, it's the macro cycle, it's what those policy dynamics mean for the interest rate outlook. That's kind of where we're focused. We're not tax advisors. I'm not going to talk you through the ins and outs of the trust changes. I guess in terms of the kind of the lens that we're taking to it, though, it's always the case that in these sorts of things, uncertainty is a big challenge in the short term. And so, while there's that lack of detail, just because the bill hasn't been written yet, are there going to be changes? Is it going to get through? Everybody, the entire professional services industry is sitting down trying to work out what do we do under these new regimes. Then maybe that means that there's kind of a bit of a pullback in lending into trust and activity, and people just kind of hit pause. So that could be one thing that we're conscious of in the short term. But yeah, beyond that, in terms of the principles of what they're looking to do on that tax mix, and again, I think it just kind of goes to that point where, the tax backdrop, the view is a bit over-reliant on labour income. One area where, there's the potential for some non-labour income to be undertaxed is those trust structures. And, I think that's the motivation certainly for the policy change.
Great, thanks, Taylor. Any other questions? It was quite detailed, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to getting the package sent to us so we can have a closer look. Any other questions?
Yeah, I've got a quick one. Taylor, sorry, on one of your last slides, you were talking about all the different banks around the world. Most of them I recognise what they stand for, but what's FOMC? I'm imagining that's Mr. Trump's country, but I'm not sure what it stands for.
Correct. So that's the Federal Reserve, FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee. So the committee that sets policy rates for the Federal Reserve System. Good question. I should label that United States.
Yeah.
That would be much more useful.
Yeah.
Or you could just label it dumpster fire. Oh.
Thanks, Charlie.
Anyone else?
Any other interesting questions?
So quiet.
Someone else want to jump on or type?
Oh, there was the one.
Oh,
in
hang
there.
on.
Yep. Drop of blue collar workers opposed to white collar. What is the driver of that?
So that was unemployment rates I was showing there. So what that's showing is not kind of a drop in blue collar workers versus white collar workers. It's that unemployment is lower among blue collar workers. And so from that perspective, it is the case that kind of that competition for labour, for blue collar worker labour, is kind of more intense at the moment, I guess. When we think about what's been driving that, what's shifted, there's a couple of dynamics to it. One is those capacity constraints in the broader construction industry are meaning that there's strength in labour demand there. And one of the things that's been a key driver of that over the past few years is you've got a lot of things trying to be delivered at once. Some of this was very bad luck. We had state governments with very full infrastructure investment pipelines back in 2019 going into the pandemic, and they've been trying to be delivered in a very, very different set of macro circumstances. And that's been, there's been large projects there that you haven't really been able to shift things quickly, and that's been driving some competition for labour in an environment in which we saw the impact of housing demand coming out of the pandemic, very, very full residential building pipelines that are still elevated. And so there's a lot of activity all happening at once. And there's a lot of things in terms of supply disruptions and other dynamics that have meant that project times have extended out as well. And so all of this is meaning that there's just a lot of strength in demand for kind of anything pointing into construction effectively is the major driver there.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks, Taylor. Lani's asked a question. Given the cumulative cost pressures small business is absorbing right now, wages, insurance, energy, and now the budget, is NAB advocating to the RBA on behalf of its small business customers for rate relief? And if so, how?
So our team is, we're not advising the RBA, we're not lobbying the RBA, we're kind of, putting our policymakers' hat-ons and trying to work out how they'll respond to the competing circumstances. So what I would say is, the RBA, that in terms of the approach that they take to this, they do have a business liaison program that they run. They do talk to businesses. They're not blind to the challenges that are being faced. I think when we think about the institutional policy settings, it's an unpopular job. It's a world in which when what central banks are trying to do is stimulate demand, people like them, it's lower interest rates. When they're trying to constrain demand, people don't like them, it's higher interest rates. And when they're trying to constrain demand because of supply constraints and unhelpful supply side dynamics, they're even more unpopular because it's not everybody can see that things are booming and so it makes sense. Its growth is okay, and yet the RBA, it's too strong for the RBA, and that's a pretty unpopular position to be in. That's why we have independent central banks. They have to make these very, very unpopular choices. And unfortunately, part of the mechanism for why monetary policy works to constrain demand and slow inflation is it makes things difficult for businesses to pass cost pressures on to end prices. So it's something that is, I fully agree that it's not popular, but it's being driven by that kind of capacity constrained environment that we find ourselves here in Australia and in the world. And so, yeah, it's a tricky set of circumstances, but they're trying to weigh a lot of competing imperatives. And the perspective is the reason why they exist is that it is very important that inflation expectations remain anchored. People can do long-term planning with an understanding of what cost price growth will be longer term. And a world in which that gets out of control is one that is, very difficult for households and businesses everywhere to deal with. So that's what they're kind of supposed to be laser focused on. But there can be some pain along the way when there's capacity constraints.
Completely agree. I think my question is more what it's more NAB direct, like what NAB is planning. Obviously, with so many businesses currently looking at their restructuring, it's a really good time to switch banks if you're not happy with your current bank. So my question is more what NAB is doing for small businesses with this in mind. Like if there is anything that, NAB is focusing on in the near future.
Well, we're currently obviously we're finding opportunity through this period at the moment. It is the best time for you and all your clients to actually review all their facilities that they have and ensure that they're on the best deal. So we are right at the very minute. We're very busy looking at other lending from other banks in terms of refinancing, restructuring, putting facilities in place that will help them with their cash flow. We are definitely looking at all of that, and obviously we wouldn't encourage customers to move at a higher rate. So we're definitely trying to win new business at a rate better than what they're on, and even our existing clients. We're actually proactively touching base with all our. Well, I can speak for my team in franchise because I just manage a franchise team. we're actually proactively reaching out to our customers just to check in to see how they're doing. Some of them are saying they are feeling it. They're wanting overdrafts. We're here to help. We are here to support. We're not here to wrap up people and just go, well, too bad, so sad. We are here to ride the storm, and it is a small storm that eventually we will get past. Like, there is always opportunity through this period, and now's the opportunity to sit down and review what you've got, and actually talk to a couple of banks to see that you are on the best offer for yourself. So that's all we can offer right now, is just to do a financial health check.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you. It's more just constantly looking for, there's always got to be positives when there's a whole heap of chaos. I'm one of those people that's always looking for the positives, and right now it's definitely looking at where my banking sits. So thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Now is the right time for people to be doing that. This is what we're talking to brands about. I mean, a lot of brands are now putting, they're putting a hold on, massive expansion plans that they possibly had. They're holding on that. So we're just saying to them, all right. So what are you also doing for your for your actual franchise partners? How are you educating them on riding through this storm? Watching the cash flow, watching how they're spending, even looking at their merchant facilities. Where have they got them? Some of them have got them with third-tier providers that they are able to surcharge. And in franchise, obviously, like with surcharge on the 1st of October sort of being eradicated. Or eliminated, I should say. I shouldn't say eradicate, that's a terrible word. Eliminated. They may not be able to pass that on. So now's the time to also review your merchant facilities. Like, it is a full financial health check. It is the best time. And I'm one of those people too that, through bad times, there's opportunities that arise. And I think we're all doing it at home too. Everybody's monitoring their fees, their subscriptions, and all of that sort of stuff. How much Uber, like takeaway you do, all of that. So now's the best time to do the same thing for your business as well. So there is opportunity, and the banks are willing. The best kind of business is to refinance existing clients, where you can actually see that they've been trading through well, and everybody's going to hit a little bit of a hurdle, but I can't see it at the moment. Things are still looking pretty good. We're not concerned here, let's just say.
Excellent. Yep.
Are we at time, Helen?
I think we're out of time, Andrew, unless it's really quick.
Just
please.
Super quick. Thank you for the answer relating to blue collar, white collar. Do you think that will change with the AI surge, more or less predominantly taking over a lot of white collar sort of industry? Can you see that changing in the next 12 to 24 months?
Yeah, so I think that if anything, that's something that means that it won't change. It's kind of, we have seen more loosening in the labour market for those white collar professionals, and that's a theme that we think is likely to continue. I think it's important not to be kind of too pessimistic, especially in those short-term dynamics. In terms of, one thing that, we hear a lot anecdotally from businesses is that to integrate the AI tools that we have into the business, it takes time, it takes expertise, it takes people to do that. And so we shouldn't expect this impact to show up immediately, and certainly won't show up all at once. But certainly when you look at where those exposures are, it's clerical work, it's routine work, it's administrative work. These are areas where jobs over time are unlikely to look recognizable. But there's a huge part of the white collar workforce where certain tasks will be made easier, will be augmented, you'll shift your focus. And, we've seen this again and again in terms of technology change. You think about computers and how much time that freed up. It just meant that we were able to do these things more efficiently, more productively, and we did more of them, and we needed more people to do more of it. So over time, maybe there are some positives there, but certainly during that transition period, that's one of the reasons why we don't expect that relative story where blue collar is a bit hotter than white collar in terms of labour availability. We don't think that's going to change in the next few years.
Thank you.
Excellent. Yep. Well, thank you, Taylor, and thank you, Arania, for very informative time today. And the numbers speak for themselves. We had over 55 people logged on today, which is excellent for listening. And I'll be remiss if I don't take the opportunity to say, can you give me a thumbs up either in the chat or on your screen? Is this a better time for a lunch and learn, afternoon and learn, than the lunchtime? What do you think? Well, I've got a couple.
Couple.
Yes, no,
Charlie's not so
maybe.
sure.
People.
Oh, I've got a heart.
Charlie does like to eat lunch and learn.
Yeah. Okay, that's all right. I thought I'd ask the question. You never know. But thank you once again to the NAB. You always lean in, you always support the FCA, and you are always there for the franchise community. And lastly, the FIAs, or the FIAs, as they're being called around the traps at the moment, the FIAs are on. 1st of June is the last day you can buy tickets. So if you're not there, you will not be there, is what I'm saying. So far, as of right this second, we are on 569 tickets.
That's awesome.
So
Well done.
you have to be in the room.
Have to be there.
You have to be in the room. So quickly log on, register your tickets. If you need help, Lisa
Happy to help.
is happy to help. So from all of us, thank you, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Next one.
And I will be sending a package as well from the NAB. And the next Lunch and Learn is another interesting one, and one that we all have to do, and that is Rest Super are sponsoring, obviously, Wednesday 3rd of June, which is next Wednesday, Payday Super, back to the 12 o'clock time, unless people say otherwise. Last minute preparations for this Payday Super. Where are you at? Are you ready? And if whether you are or you aren't, jump on and let's listen to some tips and information. Thank you so much, and thank you